Hello, I'm Julia. Welcome to the MindMatters panel. Author Quentin Crisp wrote, "The young always have the same problem, how to rebel and conform at the same time. They've now solved this by defying their parents and copying one another." Here to discuss adolescent development is clinical psychologist and family therapist Andrew Fuller.
Hi, Julia.
Teacher Narissa Rodriguez, assistant principal George Mazouris, and teacher Martin de Klerk. But before we get started, let's get some inspiration from the staff at Eagleton High.
Research has shown that the adolescent brain is very different from the adult brain, and we can find it difficult to know how to respond to the adolescent experience. So I've come up with a tool that allows us to compensate for the effects of adolescence. I call it the supervisor. And it's got some wonderful features. You know how adolescents love socialising, chatting, flirting, showing off? Well, these blinders block out peripheral vision and helps the students to focus. These earphones play a combination of whale sounds and my favourite Michael Bublé ballads. Really takes the edge off the kids. This inbuilt mobile phone allows us to send text messages and reminders, partly because the kids are so bad at planning, but also because they can't see or hear anything the teacher's doing while they're wearing the hat. Anyway, here it is in action. Isn't it great? How you feeling, Lachlan? Lachlan! Works a treat, doesn't it? We're thinking of doing a Kickstarter.
Actually, who decided whale songs were relaxing, or even songs? It's not even a guitar solo. It's hardly music. This is a fascinating topic to me because we assume that adolescents are just adolescents because that's how it is. But adolescence is different to any other time in life. How is it different to other stages of life, Andrew?
Well, teenagers receive pretty bad press a lot of the time, which is mostly undeserved. In fact, it's one of the peak times of neuroplasticity, of brain development and restructuring in our lives. And so it's a massive time where brain power builds an enormous potential over a very short period of time. And so we need to think about how we capitalise on that and how we give kids that sense of success. A couple of the main changes that are happening: the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for planning and forethought and impulse control, basically it's restructured. There's a refit mode going on, so it means some of their decision making gets a bit wonky while that's going on. Okay, so that's important.
What are the typical biological challenges adolescents face?
Well, partly you become unrecognisable to yourself. It's almost like the Incredible Hulk grows out of you. You kind of suddenly you're erupting in all sorts of ways, and hair's spurting in places you didn't expect it, and all that kind of stuff. Weird stuff's happening in your body, which is why most adults have had that experience of saying, "You know, do you remember, Martin, when you were 10?" And Martin goes, No idea. Because when you're 13, it's almost like you're just a different person. You know, you're unrecognisable to yourself. So biologically, you're incredibly different. Young women are especially vulnerable to stress because we know estrogen amplifies the stress response. That has major implications for their vulnerability. We know that, for example, boys are less resilient in childhood, and girls are less resilient in the teenage years. And partly estrogen is the culprit here, at making them more vulnerable to stress. So we need to make sure that our girls basically learn how to calm down a bit.
Is this a reflection of most adolescents, you know, sleeping, thrill-seeking, being emotional, Martin? Is that your experience?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. You can see the change across the year levels too. So as a teacher, you're kind of familiar with which year levels are acting in those certain ways, which ones sort of are lacking the motivation. And yeah, you can see that development.
And these changes sound so extreme. You sort of forget as an adult that they're not just being annoying to annoy you. It is actually, it's really hard to remember that it's not their fault, but you are driving me nuts.
Oh, definitely. With boys, they have their own agenda.
Really?
Especially around about year 8 and 9, they certainly change a lot. And you see, people will say, I don't want to teach year 8.
Yeah.
Because that's when they're absolutely out of control.
But it's normal behaviour.
Yep.
It is normal behaviour, yeah. If things like risk-taking and intense emotional experiences are normal, though, how do you leverage that in the classroom?
You've got to keep them busy. You've got to keep them engaged. You've got to give them something that they're interested in doing. You've got to make it fun.
Yeah.
I think there's also, there can be a big fear of failure too. It's easier
Why
not
start?
to put easier to come into the classroom and have that excuse, well, I just didn't study, rather than fail in front of their peers. So I think that having schools can be very outcome focused and not process focused. So focusing on the effort. And it's funny, primary schools, the kids are not scared to try and to fail, and then suddenly something happens with the changes of adolescence. They're very, very self-conscious, and to fail in front of their peers. If we learnt to walk and talk in our adolescence, we'd never do it, because you see little kids sort of falling over all the time, and they're quite happy to experiment with their language and stuff. And adolescence just, can be very, so that's sort of another sort of,
I think sometimes the risk-taking can be channeled in a way that you can actually bring about something good, bring them out in the ways that they hadn't seen themselves before, and they sort of continue along that path after they've had a go of taking a risk.
What kind of an example?
Oh, even if it's just speaking their mind about a particular topic. I know that some kids don't often like to be the spotlight, but if something sparks their attention, and they sort of think, oh, gee, that felt good. They listened to me. They try it again, and then you see the potential of that. And as a teacher, if you exploit that, you get that kid to really open up and be, contribute to that group a lot more than they normally would have.
They normally would, yeah.
And giving them autonomy too, or giving them a bit of responsibility, allowing them to lead.
We often force our kids, say Year 9, to be a parts of groups that have to take risks. It might be like putting on a play where they all have to assume a role, something they're not always comfortable with, but...
Is that funny you say risk? I assume you're making them bungee jump or something.
No.
But risk in this sense
Pick
is...
up a guitar that you haven't really played and go out and perform as part of a band, or the xylophone, or whatever it's going to be.
Yeah.
Be part of the play, or do the backstage stuff. All of those things are, in many ways, they're small steps for these guys, and risks. Just as much as bungee jumping would be for me. I think actually they don't see them as risks. That's just fun.
Yeah,
risk
right.
would be being in front of your class and doing a talk.
Andrew, is this a good idea, that kind of risk-taking?
Oh, yeah. I think one of the biggest risks really is imagining who you could be, really. I mean,
beautiful.
adolescents are idealists. They really, if they've got no breaks, really. When I work with groups of kids in schools, which I do a lot of, I'll say, you're all geniuses, you just don't know you are. In fact, all around Australia, I have parents coming up to me in railway stations and airports going, you told my kid he's a genius. Haven't seen much of it lately, but anyway. It's coming. But it is.
But how do you define genius?
Well, genius broadly, because, of course, there are many forms of genius. Genius isn't just the school marks. There are genius plumbers. There are genius, car mechanics. There are genius farmers. There's genius, all sorts of people. And so finding your own inner genius is something we've lost sight of. We've sort of seen it as a very elite kind of capacity, rather than being this innate kind of creative force that's within almost everybody. And once you capitalise on that, which in some ways is the task of adolescence, isn't it? You want to experiment, you want to kind of do weird and wacky kind of things, sometimes, rile a few people up, have a few arguments with your parents. But at the end of the day, the purpose of all of that stuff is to grow up. So if you don't do all of that stuff, you don't grow up.
Yeah.
So, lots of parents, for example, say, well, I wish my child was like they were when they were 8. But if they remain as they were when they were 8, they'll be with you until they're 58, because they're not going to grow up and move away, which is the task of really teenage years.
Yeah. At school, how do you help a student find their own identity?
You have to have that relationship. You have to have the knowledge of the student. I know, like from my experience as a student, I was encouraged to pursue music, and I wasn't going to choose the subjects, and a teacher told me to choose them, so they saw that. And the school needs to have those opportunities too, provide the different kinds of opportunities for them to explore and try a bit of this, try a bit of that, and see what they like.
I reckon teenagers form their identity from the outside in. So what I mean by that is by doing stuff rather than hearing stuff. So if I say, George, you're a kind, generous kind of guy, George may or may not believe me. George might kind of go, oh, yeah.
I believe that you are, George.
I think I am.
I don't know about that. But anyway, we'll come back to that. We can debate that later. But if I get George acting in a way where he's kind and generous and compassionate, if I give him some sort of thing to do, then he defines himself that way.
Yeah,
so it's actually by doing stuff rather than just hearing stuff or thinking it that makes the big difference in terms of adolescence.
I always started my conversations with students in class about what they like to do, and that then led to, okay, well, how would you like to explore that? So in, say, a media class, often my kids would explore a theme that they were interested in and make a film about it. That was the goal, but it made them feel good. And yeah, like you said earlier, I would encourage and say that, yeah, that you are a genius. You've just completed this project. You've made that statement with that product. So it just talking to them about where they're coming from is the first step, I think.
Do you have to interact differently with adolescents, like than you do with an adult? Are you doing something different?
It's easy. It can be easy for teachers to fall into a role, and you can see some teachers that can be a bit patronising when they're talking to students, and it can be hard to have that conversation about footy or whatever, or what you did on the weekend, and then you get an email or a conversation with a staff member about a student's done something, and then you have to have a disciplinary conversation. Right. But I think you're doing the student a disservice if you don't do that. They do respect that, and I don't think it wrecks that relationship at all. And
it's about having conversations with the world, isn't it? Your teacher is an adult in the world, and that's what you're going to face when you go out in the world.
I reckon every great teacher is a great actor, really, and their stage is their classroom. And so how they kind of move, how they interact, how they're clear about their boundaries, that allows kids to feel that, you know, that the agenda's clear in here.
What can a school do to provide opportunities for students to develop their skills for meeting life challenges?
Oh, well, I think if you provide an avenue for them to express something that other kids in a broader context can hear. So if you've got leadership opportunities, I think that's something you should encourage at every level, just so that their messages are being channeled through, so that we're listening and saying, OK, you're not happy about certain things, or you want this sort of direction to occur. At least there's an avenue. I know when I was at school there was very few opportunities to be heard.
You're reminded how stale some sort of committees can be until there's a student on there, because they're the ones that come up with the great ideas that straight away sort of the staff will say, oh, well, a negative, and say, well, that can't work. But they don't see those blockages. They see, they just, and they have that vision and that drive. And a lot of the time, they're the most successful ideas. So.
And you have to work together. At the end of the day, in a school, it's got to be a kind of a partnership between teachers and students.
Yeah.
If you're in doubt about how much life has changed from when we were teenagers, I'll leave you with this tweet from Megan Fox. We live in a world where losing your phone is more dramatic than losing your virginity.